Hello and welcome to this new video in which we will talk about 6th generation fighter jets and the SCAF, the famous Future Combat Air System, which includes the NGF, the Franco-German-Spanish 6th generation fighter jet project that has just fallen through, because we can't reach an agreement with our partners for industrial reasons. First, what exactly is a 6th generation fighter jet? It's an aircraft that will combine all the technologies and expertise of the planes it will replace, meaning the Rafale, the Eurofighter, the F-35, and the NGF. It has to be able to do absolutely everything in every dimension better than its predecessors, including electronic warfare. Radars, very long-range sensors, being able to fly higher, fire hypersonic missiles, and have directed energy weapons. And to learn more, I refer you to this video I made dedicated entirely to 6th generation aircraft technologies. Except that today, when developing an aircraft in this category, either you know how to do everything or you have to build up your skills. And that means we're going to have the technologies for each of these components in which we'll increase our expertise. The United States has this expertise because they have all the technological components, so they're developing their own 6th generation aircraft called the NG-8 with a first prototype that could fly in 2019. And then there are other countries. China obviously is trying to build up its capabilities. They're catching up. The Russians, they still can't finish their Sukhoi 57. They're having a lot of difficulties. And we can see that the technologies used inside are clearly outdated. The Indians say so. And the photos they consistently leak show that they are not mature in industrialization and in relatively simple technologies, including avionics. For example, we can see it here with this head-up display, which is from an older generation on the Sukhoi 57 compared here, for example, with what can be done on the Gripen. And France is therefore one of only 2 countries in the world that truly has all the expertise in every field to be able to produce an aircraft from A to Z based on technologies that are truly mature and operational today. France has a real advantage over all its European competitors, especially because the Rafale is a true export success. If we compare it, for example, with the Eurofighter or the Gripen, the Eurofighter exports much less successfully. It's sold mainly to the countries that participated in the Eurofighter program: Spain, Italy, Great Britain, and Germany. The Gripen, for its part, managed to export mainly to Brazil, but overall sales are very few. And the advantage of the Rafale selling so well is that with India, the Emirates, Indonesia, all these countries today, they are gaining expertise with the Rafale and co-investing in improving the Rafale towards these future standards. So today, the Rafale has technologies that, for some of them, for example in optical systems, are better than what you can find on so-called 5th generation aircraft like the F-35. And so, without needing to invest in developing new technologies, we already have the Rafale improving, and in its F-5 standard, it will have some technological components of the 6th generation. So that gives France a real advantage and strengthens Dassault's legitimacy to be the main contractor for the SCAF and the 6th generation combat system aircraft, the SCAF. Except that the Germans don't see it exactly that way. There's a division of roles that makes sense, based on the industrial contribution and investment of each country. Thinking, well, each country will do 30 for the Germans, 30 for the Spaniards. And then France does the rest, being recognized as the best at the top, the best, so the coordinator. A bit like what we see with the British. With the GCAP, the British with the Italians, and now with the Japanese, well, the overall architecture and the engines, it's the English. Electronic warfare, sensors, radars, that's going to be the Italians. The airframe, avionics, stealth, onboard computers, that's going to be the Japanese. This creates a coherent, logical distribution. We have the Germans. Whereas with the Germans, the distribution isn't as interesting or smart. Whereas with the Germans, the distribution isn't meant to be as interesting and intelligent. France is certainly better than the Germans in absolutely every one of these areas, and we see it consistently in every competition. The Rafale technically beats the Eurofighter in every combat area, and on top of that, it's cheaper. So it's obviously complicated for the Germans to claim to have leaders in a field, but nevertheless, we could divide the roles by saying that the Germans, you will handle artificial intelligence. The Spanish, you will work on stealth. By the way, that's what we tried to do, but after I don't know how many years of work, they were so far behind what Dassault was already doing a few years ago with the Neuron, that in the end we took that package away from them because they don't have the level to be able to develop it. But nevertheless, we could at least try to provide each manufacturer with an area of expertise in which they can deepen their skills. Except that today it's not exactly this good method, the English method, the method we usually see that's being accepted. The Germans want to catch up, including in areas where they are not at all at the level of the French. And so they demand not only to have 30% of the workload, which makes sense, but to be in 30% of absolutely everything. Typically, electric flight controls. Dassault is the world champion in electric flight controls. Even the United States says so. They are really, really strong. It's the control system, the computer that's between the pilot's hand and the control surfaces. So basically, even if the pilot pulls really hard on the stick, the plane won't stall. It won't go into a flat spin. It will always operate within a flight envelope that keeps it effective. During a go-around, the plane won't do the opposite of what the pilot commands, like what happened with some F-35s that led to the loss of aircraft. And so, flight controls are truly a Dassault expertise. The Germans want a 30% share of the flight controls. They want to be involved in 30% of absolutely everything, except that when you're in 30% of the flight controls, you have visibility over all the know-how and you're able to plunder decades of effort and development that are Dassault's industrial property. Without any effort, just because you demand to be involved in absolutely everything. And so this distribution, by avoiding dividing up the roles in a coherent, logical way, based on what we know how to do, or else with investments in new technologies that don't yet exist, the combat cloud and so on, which went to the Germans, they want to be everywhere so Dassault won't let its technologies be stripped away. The Germans, knowing the French can't develop the plane alone or fund it themselves, say the French will eventually give in. And so we have two countries looking at each other suspiciously without being able to make a clear decision at the political level. They are the only ones who can steer the decision. Germany, the German government, German politicians should have been able to tell Airbus, listen, your demands are out of reach, they're irrelevant, they're unfair, from France's point of view. And it's legitimate for France to defend its industrial and technological heritage. They're trying to keep the lead they've gained, which is the result of our efforts since General de Gaulle. So, unfortunately, the Germans are sticking to this position. Mind you, another factor is the start of the war in Ukraine, which has caused Germany's defense budget to skyrocket. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in investments beyond what was planned in the past. That means the Germans could use their extra money to finance the sixth-generation aircraft on their own. Why would Airbus need this partnership now when they could get much more research and development funding to develop it on their own? So, Germany, and Airbus in particular, almost have an interest in ending this partnership, because instead of doing 30% of a joint development, they could do 100% of the development on their own. Or they could clearly be the leaders in the field by partnering with 2 or 3 countries around them. But let's say that Airbus has an interest in a clash in order to get more money, more investment. And here we need to listen to what Tom Enders is saying. Tom Enders is the former head of Airbus Defense, a German. He clearly said 2 things. First, it was a mistake to buy the F-35. Well, that's confirmed. I think we've made enough videos on the subject to say that. The F-35 was a mistake. But anyway. Then he says Germany is going to spend colossal amounts of money to catch up, to be able to reach the level necessary for a 6th-generation aircraft. So we need to remain partners. He says partnering with France was a bad idea since we're not complementary and can't work together. Because, incidentally, it's actually the Germans who are leaving projects like the latest generation Tiger. They abandoned France and Spain in order to develop it further. The Germans didn't buy the maritime patrol aircraft offered by Airbus to go buy American ones. It's the Germans who go to the United States to buy cruise missiles or set up air defense, even though there are perfectly effective, even more efficient systems in Europe. So that's understandable. That's the German point of view, obviously, whether it's justified or not, at least from their perspective. An expert like Tom Enders says it very clearly. That was a bad option from the start, and the option we're choosing now is even worse, because the necessary investments will handicap the operational military capability of the German army for decades and decades. By swallowing, too much money into the development of a plane that will just flatter the German ego. Those are his exact words. So now the question is whether France is capable of cooperating under the conditions that the English have implemented for their own GCA for their fighter jet. The answer is yes. It's 100 times yes. Remember the Neuron Project. The Neuron, that pseudo-stealth combat aircraft whose successor will be able to accompany the Rafale starting from 2035. The avionics system and the fuel system were Saab. The firing system and the electronic system were the Italians from Leonardo. The wings and the ground station were Airbus. Everything on the test bench, including the stealth nozzles, was Hellenic Aerospace. The weapons interface was the Swiss from Ruag. The avionics, the data link, that was Thales. And Dassault was above it all as the main contractor, coordinating everyone and really acting as the conductor. And it works. And so that's exactly how projects should be managed. Not by trying to steal each other's technologies, because that leads to failures like the one we just saw, or to extremely complex projects where everyone is just trying to catch up technologically. That's the case, for example, with the NH90 or other projects, where everyone tries to pull in their own direction, and that increases development costs and makes the specifications very complex. So now the question is, what will happen next? There will inevitably be a reshuffling at the European level, with France and Germany taking the lead. There will inevitably be two competing aircraft. Will the Germans join the British? But with what I told you earlier, their desire to capture a lot of money, obviously they won't do it. Airbus also includes Airbus Spain, so it's likely that Spain will stay with the Germans. So, on the other side, what options are left? Can France partner with Saab in particular? With Belgium, which was an observer? With Poland? With Greece? So that's at the European level. And here we really have some interesting prospects because these countries can offer complementary expertise, and by clearly dividing the roles, with France clearly as number one and assigning a certain number of tasks, there's a way to move forward and do something effective. The second option is to look beyond Europe, obviously. Who are the major clients of the Rafale, and among these major clients, which countries today want to develop a sixth-generation aircraft? India and the Emirates both want to boost their capabilities. You have companies like Edge, which are starting to work in France, whose headquarters, their main office, is currently in Paris. All of this is a sign, obviously they already have workshops that are also in Bordeaux. So today, the question is political. Do we accept to say that, well, if we develop a plane, we need a strategic vision over several decades? Will we have a strategic vision that will be aligned with the Indians over several decades? Well, at first glance, we say we are closer to the Germans than to the Indians, except that the Indians are facing the Chinese threat. And by 2050, very clearly, the Chinese will overtake the Russians, so the Russians will have Chinese planes. So we Europeans will be facing Chinese technologies just like the Indians. Why not the Iranians? So the Emirates must also face these Chinese planes that could eventually be available to Iran. So today, these countries will be facing the same threats as us. France obviously needs its nuclear capabilities, so it needs a plane with nuclear capabilities. Will the Indians also want to have a sixth-generation aircraft with nuclear capabilities as well? In that case, they could develop a brick on their side. But at the very least, it requires having a plane that is hardened against electromagnetic pulses. For example, the Germans. The Germans claim they want to be the future leaders of nuclear power in Europe, of nuclear weapons. They want to acquire nuclear weapons, but they didn't want the SCAF to be nuclear capable, even though they themselves claim to be. They were looking for any excuse they could to accuse France of pursuing technological paths that, well, they were just looking for an excuse to say that France was the one acting in bad faith. So expanding this partnership from an industrial point of view with countries that clearly recognize the leadership of Dassault and France would make sense. Doing it alone, and remember my friend Bruno from Bruno Aviations, I'll share his YouTube channel link with you again. He made a video dedicated to this question with a petition to be able to push for France to develop on its own a next-generation, sixth-generation fighter, even though I still don't really like the term generation. So here it's a matter of political will. Do we have tens and tens of billions of euros to invest in this project today? That's the real question. And now I turn to how relevant this sixth-generation aircraft is. Is it really necessary to make a piloted aircraft that is the best of all technologies of each of these requirements that I mentioned earlier? Or another option, which is actually starting to take up a lot of space, aren't we rather accumulating dedicated drones, each with its own specific function? The electronic warfare drone, the radar drone, the drone that drops bombs, the stealth drone that can get a little closer. And why make a device that can do everything, that's very expensive, very complex, very heavy, and piloted, which adds even more complexity, instead of making lots of drones, coordinating smart drones, combat drones, a bit like the Neuron, which by working in a swarm would overall cost less, be easier to replace and upgrade, and would potentially be more effective than a single device by multiplying the vectors like that. So there really are questions of positioning and strategic vision over several decades. In this context, we would have a command aircraft, maybe a Rafale B two-seater, maybe A400Ms, maybe A330 MRTT tanker aircraft, maybe radar planes, which would coordinate these drone tests, which could organize like that a battlefield with a strategic global vision coordinated between piloted aircraft and unmanned combat drones. So those are really the questions we need to ask ourselves. But even if we don't want to, in the end, and we decide in 2035 not to make sixth-generation piloted aircraft, we absolutely have to insist on developing each of these technological building blocks. Stealth is needed for a very small percentage of missions, for example, for SEAD, for destroying enemy air defenses to open up the sky for everyone who will come in behind. We need aircraft that can conduct electronic warfare, offensive electronic warfare. That means intercepting enemy radars or our enemy's communications. If there is a radio, for example, or a drone pilot, to be able to know where they are by detecting the waves being emitted, and then possibly to conduct offensive electronic warfare. A bit like the EA-18 Growler, which emits so many waves toward that radar that the radar stops working. We need very efficient optical sensors that can see very, very far, or maybe optical sensors that are inexpensive, expendable, with a drone that goes into harm's way and that we can afford to lose because it's cheaper than a missile. And that allows for observation, a bit like what the Ukrainians are doing today with their ISR drones. So we absolutely need to develop each of these technologies, these technological building blocks, and we need to keep investing in them. And if by chance we find partners who are smart enough to understand that we are complementary and not systematically in competition, we can succeed in making a predominantly French aircraft of this future generation, which is meant to succeed the Rafale F5, which will arrive in 2035, with all its performance, all its capabilities, accompanied by a stealth combat drone. And that will be the core of our Air Force, and also of our Navy, for decades and decades. So today, obviously it's bad news, it's not a surprise, but if there is, and once again, to really ensure expertise that allows them to build their skills, and to attract other countries with them. Well, there is a way to come out on top, and that it's certainly a better device, which costs us less, in which we have a better position, with the Germans no longer with us than in the position we were in just a few weeks ago. At least now the abscess has burst, and we can move on, but we have to be quick to find the right partners to work with. There you go. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very soon.